Welcome to Tales of Britain and Ireland. This is a podcast telling the stories, legends and folktales of Britain and Ireland in no particular order. Presented by Graham and coming direct from South Yorkshire, each episode tells a story or selection of stories from all across these islands and throughout their history, followed by a short and decidedly inexpert discussion of the origin and themes of each tale.
Hello everyone and welcome back. This time it's part 2 of Guy of Warwick. As always, with multiple episode stories, I recommend that if you haven't listened to it already, go back and listen to the first episode, but I can't control what you do, so you do you. As always, I want to get through this bit quick. Just one other thing to say, if you happen to be listening to this before 24th of July 2026 and live in Bristol, I'm doing an event under the Clifton Suspension Bridge all that weekend. Check out my social media for links to tickets. And for everyone else, I'll be announcing more live shows towards the end of the year, very soon indeed, so keep your eye on social media or whatever they say. That is more than enough chit-chat. Thank you so much for listening in. Let's crack on with Guy of Warwick 2. Or Guy of War Roman numerals 2 ick. It doesn't really work if you say it. To the story. Let us start after today's story has finished. This was not the way it had to be. Deep down she was always aware of it, but mostly she ignored it. But sometimes it was thrown into such stark relief. She would see it in those she helped. And she helped many, poor desperate things, who God in his infinite wisdom had brought poverty and illness the like of which she would never have to contend with. And mostly she would feel moved by their plight, a great pity, a joy for all that she could do to alleviate the sufferings of the huddled masses, so much less fortunate than her. And then she would see some unfortunate wretch of a mother sing a lullaby, her arm-rocked babe drift off to dreamland, a smile on its face. Or the snatched kisses of young lovers, half-starved they may be, but yet still with the energy to be overcome with a desire for each other. Or an adult son who gifted his bread dole to his elderly father, and the look of gratitude in the old man's eyes. And in little moments like these, and there were many of them, the thought would occasionally flash across her mind that it was her who was truly impoverished, and they who had all the riches of the world. And that hard ball of hate in her heart grew a little bigger. A reminder, this is not a love story. At our story's start, love is about to win out because Guys, gender neutral referring to the collective you listening, Guy, singular, masculine referring to Guy of Warwick, is back. Not just in your ears but on England's sceptred shore, away from his brief sojourn to the continent to win fame and renown, both successfully done. And honestly, that's about all you need to know here. Listen to the last episode for details, but in short, he has just taken part in a tournament where he bested Europe's finest warriors, proving himself the undisputed champion of the continent. And this was surely enough to achieve that goal. The goal, of course, being to win enough renown that the dad of the love of his life, Felice, the Earl of Warwick, he was the Earl of Warwick, not her, would overlook Guy's status as a mere steward's son, which, as a reminder, was actually pretty prestigious but not quite Earl level, and so allowed the marriage between the two of them to take place. Because if a guy didn't have title or money, he was not normally marriage to Earl's daughter material, but if he was really good at killing things, then he still might be the kind of guy that you wanted in the family. That was the plan, and having done that, he was back, undisputed hero. And so, of course, when he sat down, he headed straight off to Warwick to be reunited with his love and to put their plan into motion. Felice had heard of his great victories against knights in a tournament and awaited him at Warwick Castle. She is flanked by many damsels, all topped with wimples and hennin, like Ren Fair backing dancers constantly on the edge of bursting out into a full musical-style song and dance routine. Guy bows low. and once again we are led to believe that he is smooth with the charm, a prowess with wooing words to match that he possesses in battle. My lady, too long have I been absent from your presence, starved and waning through absence. But now I may feast my eyes on your transplendent beauty, quench my soul on thy countenance bright. A benighted traveller from a dark, pathless forest of terrors, emerging into the light of dawn which ushers in the sun's refulgent beams. When death raged around me, by which he means he was killing people, it was thoughts of you that inspired me to continue on. By that he means continue killing people. And in victory I rejected the beauty this sword won me, paid no heed to the Emperor's daughter. And then Guy adds, I think quite ill-advisedly, even though that daughter was divinely fair and second to you, the most comeliest woman in the world. Even then the sight of her was not enough to make me false, even though a sea of princely blood I spilt to obtain her. And this, listener, is evidence that he knows what he has done. He is totally complicit. I am still mad from the last episode on behalf of the Emperor, his daughter Matilda, all those nobles who were killed or grievously wounded for something the Guy ultimately did not want. But he skips over that bit and continues, So, Felice, say that you still wish to be mine as I wish to be yours. Please, I implore you, let not the sun set forever on your true champion by spurning him now. And he kneeled in supplication. And now I think comes a pivotal point in this story, a sliding doors moment. Because she has a choice here. She says all the right words, how she is totally overcome with love, uses phrases like, Cupid let fly from his bended bow a glittering shaft that lodged in my breast, and other love lines that also sound quite euphemistic. She gives the impression to him, to those around, and even possibly to herself that she is truly desperate for him. And then Felice tells Guy, but you need more victories, more laurels, more renown. And listener, it frustrates me that I can't get inside her head, understand what her motives are here, why she doesn't just say, great, we love each other, you've had lots of victories, let us be wed. Now, her stated reason he must do more is just a sort of nebulous quote, for my honour's sake. But does she really think him unworthy? Didn't she sort this out back in the first episode? Isn't her father meant to be the one stopping things now? Maybe she genuinely thinks that her father will need more. She's projecting impossible standards from her father. Potentially that's it, but maybe she's just pissed off with Guy about the ungainly comments on how fit the Emperor's daughter was. That also seems possible and understandable. Or maybe, just maybe, she's having full-on second thoughts. I cannot say with certainty. Sometimes, much as it pains my narrative style, I must cast away my pretense at omniscience and just be content with telling you the events as they played out, and so she says, you need more. And the world takes one direction, where it might have taken another. And you know what? Guy takes it surprisingly well. Given how crushed his speech implied he would be, it seems the fact that she was still interested at all was good enough for him, and if he had to wait a little longer, do a little more, then he was well prepared to do that. And he cracks out an incredibly metal line. I understand, my lady. And so I shall not yet discharge my servant, Death. He must again ride with me, and together we shall rain terror upon the land. Armies fall before me, like autumnal leaves assailed by gusty winds. Pretty damn cool, Guy, but getting dark, pretty dark. But he continues, before I take my leave, it would strengthen my warrior's heart and uplift my soul to the heavens, bolster my resolve, if you, my goddess, could encircle me in your arms and give me one soft, hallowed kiss. Barely had those words left Guy's mouth when Felice's lips replaced them. A long, passionate kiss. To reassure him that she felt it. And either all her ladies around her started whooping and hollering and doing, yeah, get in there, girl, or they sort of looked at the ground awkwardly, the sky, anywhere but the scene in front of them. There's no in-between. and until it did, it seemed like that kiss would never end. After that, there was nothing more to say. Felice turned, swept away, her ladies followed, and Guy turned and left Warwick Castle behind him. There was violence to be wrought upon the world. But he didn't get very far, because next stop was the Earl. That is, Felice's father. Earl Roband was his name, and the Earl was delighted to see Guy back. He had heard all about Guy's exploits, and he was proud of the lad. If you remember, the Earl had already shown an interest in Guy's phenomenal combat powers when he was a teenager, using him as a bit of entertainment, as the young lad took on all comers for the Earl and his guests to watch. So I think he felt quite a bit of love for the lad. So happy was he to see him, he threw Guy a proper medieval banquet. I've described those before, I'm not going to do it again, but you've got boar and lute and goblets and wine and raucous laughter. Great to have you back, lad. And Guy enjoyed himself, but he was very careful not to let the Earl know about the thing he had for Felice. The Earl, who, as the most powerful man in Warwick, surely knew that Guy had just been to the Earl's own castle and kissed his daughter in front of a lot of people on that very day. And even if he didn't, even if his information network was rubbish because he spent all his money on banquets and not spies, well, the Earl had definitely heard tell of Guy's exploits across Europe. He talked to him about them. And when it came to the tales of Guy's exploits, Guy was famed for basically two things. 1. Beating the shit out of everyone he met with near supernatural ease. 2. Declaring that the reason he did this was all for the love of the Lady Felice, daughter of the Earl of Warwick, back in England. Felice's sweet name was the very last words that had entered many an ear. And I cannot believe that his reputation for point 1, the murder, gets back to England without point 2, the love of Felice. So Earl Roband knows, right? And I'd like to think he's sort of politely not mentioning it, trying not to embarrass Guy, but also trying to get it brought up in a roundabout way, awkwardly after a bit of wine. So, dropping the line, "So, my lad, anyone special in your life?" Guy looks panicked, doesn't know what to say. "Oh no, too much war. Married to the sword. Nice guys finish last, no luck with the ladies." Shifty eyes. The Earl sighs, but figures the lad will tell him in his own time. "Okay, well," avuncular pat on the back. "You be sticking around though, lad, now?" "No," says Guy, "back to the continent. There's wars and victories to be won." And the Earl, the one who Guy is meant to be impressing with all of these victories, he says words to the effect of, "Don't you think you might be better off in your own homeland here? Maybe settle down? Hint, hint." No, there's not really any battle, any chance to win fame and spoils here. Gotta go to the continent." "But you will return, yes?" says the Earl. "Maybe one day you could find a home, even at the castle itself." The hint is dropped so heavily it makes a sound as it hits the floor, and Guy says, "Oh, thank you, but no, that's quite all right." And at that point the Earl flat out gives up. "Surf," he calls, "bring out ye olde Jaeger bombs," and a great chorus of "Way" goes up, and the night fades into a blur. Sometime late the next morning, Guy gets up. His head hurts a little, but mostly his mind is just filled with an itch, a compulsion, thoughts of getting out of this country and getting back to the fighting. He just about remembers his mum and dad, pops in to see them briefly. His mother, who we don't really hear a lot about, is tearful to see him, and then tearful as he says he's off again immediately. His father is more reserved about it, but also says, "Why don't you stay here, son?" "Oh no, father, I couldn't. I made a promise to a certain someone," Shifty looks. "Can't say who, that I would go back to war." Or really to war for the first time, because I've not been in a proper war, whatever. Back to fighting, and I have to keep that promise, and that's the only reason. A man must abide by his word. "It brings me no joy," he insisted, while sort of vibrating with enthusiasm to get into the fray. "But I am oath-sworn, so I must depart." Seeing that he could not be dissuaded, they bid him farewell and wished him God's blessing, and then Guy was heading back to the coast. Which is all a bit of an anticlimax to the conclusion of last episode, really. His brief visit home is pretty much over, and fortune again waits in a foreign land. Soon our very English hero is in the Channel again, standing magnificently at the bow of some great vessel as the music swells with the promise of adventure. Oh yes, before he got there, he did meet a very big cow. But we're actually going to talk about that in a later episode. Now, Europe was a continent riven by war. Farms plundered, towns razed, violence, looting and murder were the order of every day, ranging from tiny bandit gangs raiding fortified villages to massive pitched battles between vast professional armies. Now, this was not a break from the normal peaceful order of things. No, this was the everyday, as it had been for centuries, would be for millennia more, an ever-shifting map of enmities and temporary alliances. Far before the sovereign nation-state cut up the continent, power was just a seething, writhing mass of disparate, fluctuating polities, a mess of unstable hierarchies. Empires, kingdoms, dukedoms, principalities, city-states all fought between each other, within each other. If you weren't fighting the duchy next door, you were fighting your son for your duchy, or for your emperor in his fight against his son for his empire, or the raiders from overseas who fancied your kingdom a bit. Oh look, and now the raiders have teamed up with your son. So now you've got to team up with the nephew of the overseas raiders, and wait, now the Pope's invading with a mercenary army, but hang on, he hasn't paid them, so they're going to go and invade Rome. Oh, and all of Christian Europe should really unite against the huge threat of the encroaching Arab armies, but now you think about it, they might be quite helpful in your new plot against the emperor's son. Maybe the Caliph would like to marry your daughter. I'm not going to make computer game references this episode like I did in the last one, that shtick really only works once, but if I was to labour that, then the world that Guy's on the precipice of here is that of Europa Universalis, or your Crusader kings, though also with the odd dragon thrown in just to sweeten the pot a bit. But Guy is not one of the great leaders moving the pieces around, just a commoner, like all real people. But unlike most real people, he is not just living a short, brutish life, trying to avoid as much of all of this nonsense as possible, squeeze as much of the good juice out of existence before dying in childbirth. He is wading right into the thick of it, eager to be part of it all. Death his companion, not his adversary, and he fears no man nor woman neither. Arriving on that foreign shore, he seeks a war, any war, the bigger the better. War, what is it good for? Winning the hand of Felice in a very convoluted, lengthy route. Now, you might be expecting him to set off alone, apart from the ship's crew or whatever, and that's how it's been to this point, but by now his fame has spread so much that he's attracted to him people who are sort of like groupies, but groupies who get involved. Noble men who also thirsted for adventure and wanted to ride on his coattails. So a sort of adventuring party formed around him, but not a typical D&D type one, because, well, for one, Guy was clearly the main character, the others had pledged themselves to him and were very much not his equals, but also this adventuring party was very badly diversified in terms of class both in the traditional sense and the D&D sense, because each and every one of them was a noble knight. There was Sir Harold, a knight, Sir Edfrid, another knight, and Sir Martis, oh, what a knight. Yes, this was definitely night time. And slight spoiler here, do not worry too much about remembering those names. Together, Guy and the Guyettes, or Guy and the Foals, where Foals means followers. No, that was awful. The Good Guys? No, somehow that implies they're all called Guy. The guys, I'm getting some semantic saturation on the word guy now, but that's it, the guys accompany him. He's not alone. So anyway, Guy and his guys rock up in France, and they take a ride across the country looking for adventure, by which I mean any sort of warfare they could sort of insert themselves into as soldiers of fortune. But it seems they were looking for adventure in all the wrong places, because there was none to be found. Crazy, I know, right? But after weeks of fruitless searching with not even a proper tavern brawl to their name, It seemed France was uncharacteristically violence-free. So, right, Germany then, the next logical choice. The court of the Emperor was where they would head. You remember the Emperor, right, with the daughter, Blanche, who was the second most beautiful woman in the world, as judged by Guy, who has basically met two women who aren't his mother. The Emperor, who had given Guy a ship and all the other prizes for the tournament and told him to go back to England and please never return. That Emperor's court. They could go there. What could possibly go wrong? Now, let's go back in time a little to the aftermath of that tournament. The time when Guy was travelling back to England. When the German Emperor and his court had seen Guy off and vowed never to mention any of this again, there was still the issue of Blanche's marriage. Over the course of the next few weeks, many of the knights struck down by Guy in his zeal to win a prize he didn't want died of their wounds, most quite horribly. But some did not die, and amongst those was Otton, Duke of Tuscany. You might remember him as the one who hadn't even wanted to marry Blanche in the first place, but who had taken up against Guy to avenge his friend, who did. Well, things have a funny way of working out, because as she visited his bedside to thank him for what he had done, impressed by the loyalty he had shown his friend, a certain spark fired between Blanche and Otton. And she soon found herself returning often with some excuse or another. Now, the Emperor was not keen to have another tournament, and so soon gave his approval to the obviously genuine love that was growing gradually between Blanche and the invalid Duke. Honestly, he wanted just done with her. And in a few weeks, Otton was on the road to recovery, and the two were seeing each other as much as custom permitted, the Duke remaining at the Emperor's court. Soon there would be a wedding. True love from hard times, a flower blooming in the harshest ground. So despite the death of his good friend Prince Filianus, his own awful wounds, Otton, Duke of Tuscany, was relatively happy, filled with joy at the thought of his upcoming nuptials. When he got word that Guy of Warwick was riding to the Emperor's court along with 3 other English knights. There was a long pause after the message was delivered. The messenger stood there awkwardly. Duke Otton started to shake. Next to him, Blanche gasped. "He's changed his mind. He's coming back for you, to take you away." It was the only possible explanation. What could they do? Guy and his 3 mates were riding through some Germanic forest, probably full of wolves and woodcutters, gingerbread cottages and the like. They were engaging in good nightly chat. Guy was probably telling them all how amazingly hot Blanche was, but that he had turned her down for the love of Felice, who was definitely the most beautiful woman in the entire world, and the older men who had some experience exchanged looks. Sir Edfrid offered "There are a great many women in this world, my..." And he never finished his sentence, because an arrow had gone straight through his neck. He was coughing up blood, falling from his horse, foot caught in the stirrups, dragged along by the fleeing beast. Guy ducked to the side to avoid another incoming arrow. They'd walked straight into an ambush. Duke Otton's men, 16 of the best, sent to stop Guy in his awful scheme to reclaim Blanche. As Sir Martis is stunned in shocked horror, Guy feels very different. He feels like he's alive. This is it, my guys! This is what we've come here for! Fighting! Men are appearing amongst the trees, some with bows, some with swords. "Bring it," says Guy, dodging another arrow with incredible reflexes, drawing his glittering sword and charging down on the nearest attacker, an attacker who is soon in pieces. Guy jumps down from his horse. "Come and get it!" And they came, and they got it. A red mist descended around Guy, completely overwhelming him. His mind is gone, replaced with only the urge to kill and the skill to achieve it. His blade goes snicker-snack, and all it touches soon lies slain or grievously wounded upon the earth, a rain of armoured limbs and helmed heads scattered around the forest floor like leaves. The fury wanes only when no more flesh is presented to him to rend. He's panting hard. He comes to his senses, takes stock of the carnage, but also the absence of the other knights. For one terrible moment he looks for them amongst the bodies that he has felled. But no, they were not there. And as his senses come back, he realises that in his blind rage pursuing the attackers, he was now far from where they had been attacked, and in fact, he could hear distant shouts and cries, the clash of metal and metal. He runs towards the sound of battle and arrives just to see the last of his three companions, Harold, struck down to the ground. The remaining attackers, 10 of them, look around at this blood-spattered bringer of death and make a fatal miscalculation as to the benefits of their vast numbers against his one. And soon all but one of them lie dead. That last was not in a better position. His arms were broken, a leg hacked off at the shin. Guy just managed to hold himself off for long enough to demand of the poor man, "Why?" And between screams he got the garbled story. Duke Otton had sent them for Blanche. And when the story was out, the poor unfortunate didn't even have to beg to be killed, for Guy graciously obliged without him needing to voice it. He was intuitive like that. And an awful silence fell across the forest. Guy turned his attention to the bodies of his former comrades, considerably less mangled than his own kills. In fact, Harold, was that? Yes, there was a breath. Guy knelt beside Sir Harold. His eyes flickered. His breaths came shallowly, and he could not respond, but he was not yet departed. "You live." Guy checked the other two, but they were truly gone. And now Guy pondered what to do. They were all alone here in the middle of the forest. He couldn't just leave Harold, obviously. He could try carrying his friend on a horse, but with wounds like that, the shock would probably kill him. No, surely the only option was to stay with him for some time, nurse him as best he could, put off pursuing Duke Otton to get revenge, appreciate that while the others were dead, he could still save Harold's life, and in doing so he might learn a valuable lesson about how not all problems can be solved by violence or something like that. Or there was the other option. The other option was to find a hermit who serendipitously lived in a cave nearby, a hermit with whom Guy had no previous relation, and tell the hermit that he, the hermit, had to look after Harold and make sure he was okay, do the whole nursing him back to health thing. Oh, and also the hermit had to bury the 2 English knights, but not bury any of the other bodies littering the forest. And Guy even went as far to lay a curse on the hermit if he didn't do any of this. And this makes me think quite a lot of things. Firstly, Guy, why are you being so lazy? Help your friend out! These people have just died for you. Goodness. Also, why are you trusting this random hermit to do this? Maybe he'll just wander off and not get involved at all. He's a hermit, alone, probably for a reason. But it also makes me feel really sorry for the hermit, living in the middle of the forest, having this thrust on him after having maybe not dealt with people for years. This is almost certainly precisely the kind of thing that had drawn him to being a hermit in the first place. People. But that was the option that Guy plumped for, dumped his mate on the astonished hermit who is definitely going to look after him, and off Guy set, bewailing the loss of his good friend. And now he had even more reason to go to the Emperor's court, to find Duke Otton and get his revenge. But when his men didn't return, the Duke made some correct assumptions and him and Blanche skedaddled. And so when Guy arrived at the court, neither of them could be found and everyone was acting real ignorant about their whereabouts, though full of apologies. Because they all assumed, reasonably enough I think, that Guy wanted Blanche, especially given that he was now asking after her. They were very polite and flattering to him though. So, what now? He might have hit a brick wall. He could sort of force it out of the people here, take on the Emperor of Germany himself, or he could go back and get Harold from the hermit and see how he was doing, see if those people who had followed him from England got a proper burial at least. Nah, none of that, because there was a tournament on. I don't know who was organising it, but I'm pretty sure it wasn't very long before that organiser dearly wished there hadn't been. It feels a bit like Guy's a Premier League footballer turning up at a Sunday afternoon under-10s and then celebrating wildly when he dominates the field, scoring tens of goals, demanding to be given man of the match as appalled parents look on. I know technically he's just a guy, but he's also not. He's at another level. He may well be the sword of the god Mars or some kind of apprentice in training to the angel of death. It's no fun for anyone else. He wins quickly. They just let him take his prizes and then pack him off somewhere else after congratulating him and buttering him up as much as possible. So Guy decides he won't go back and try to find those people. He'll continue his jet-setting lifestyle. He's done Paris, probably Aachen, where the Emperor's court was, and now he's following the fashionable set off to Milan, because he's a budding fashionista, and apparently Europe is incredibly easy to traverse. He gets to Milan, where he's put up by the Duke of that city, a guy who Guy believes is his friend, and I choose to believe treats Guy ever so well only because he's absolutely terrified of him. There's a few days where the Duke is desperately putting on entertainments, feasts and hunting for Guy, and Guy just thinks he's being nice, when finally the Duke of Milan hears some fantastic news. Well, it wouldn't normally be fantastic. His ally, the Duke of Louvain, was under attack from the Duke of Lorraine. Yes, this is going to get a bit confusing. No, it wasn't normally a good thing when your ally was under attack, but right now this was pretty convenient because, well, he had a Guy problem, and Guy wanted a war, and now there was a war. And Guy could go and help out the Duke of Milan's ally, the Duke of Louvain, against the Duke of Lorraine. Phew! For Guy, too, this was most welcome news. Finally, an opportunity to fight and kill. He hadn't done that since the forest. I mean, win renown so he could marry the fair Lady Felice or whatever the cover story is. Just the little matter of taking the 1,000 or so kilometre jaunt basically all the way back up to the north where he had come from on the border between France and Germany. But Europe was easily traversable. And there's a dotted line appearing on a sepia map starting Milan, heading north to Louvain, modern-day Leuven, by the way, when suddenly, in a forested area, the dotted line stops. The screen freezes, and then the camera zooms in and transitions to live action. Guy is upon his horse, riding hard, when, approaching him, he sees a figure, clad in old grey robes, head hooded. Guy addresses him. "Fellow traveller, what news is there?" Which basically before the printing press was the way you got your news. You just asked random people what was up. "Ah," said the traveller, not looking up, "I'm afraid I cannot help you there, for I have given up caring about this world for the time being. For you see, I have lost my very best friend, and I am searching the world for him, and until we are reunited I take no interest in any matters of state or church. Just walk endlessly seeking him out. Oh, if only I could hear his voice again." Guy listens to the voice. "Harold? Is that you?" The figure looks up, the hood falls from his face. Guy lifts his visor. "Oh, mercy me," says Harold. "My suffering is at an end. I thought I would never find you, but of course I knew you would come back for me. You'd not just abandoned me in the forest to some hermit you'd never met. You must have had a good reason to go away, and now you're back, my friend, my brother." There were tears in his eyes. "Oh yes, of course, Harold. All about coming back for you I was. That's just what I was doing. Never leave my good buddy behind, my best pal, never." I know, Guy, so good to see you again." "You too," said Guy, hoping that the conversation wouldn't turn to Sir Martis or Sir Edfrid, and those hopes were realised. Harold, still fairly wounded, was like a loyal dog with big eyes and a tongue hanging out, bouncing around, just so grateful for Guy's presence. Well, what now, Guy? Now we are back together. Well, said Guy, I did have something planned, actually, for after I found you. We are off to Louvain to defend it from the Duke of Lorraine. Great, no questions asked, and Harold swings up onto the horse behind Guy, and the two ride off. The Guy's guys might be gone, but Guy now has a loyal sidekick. After several more days of travel, they arrive a few miles from the besieged city, already surrounded by the Duke of Lorraine's troops. Guy looks over the massed ranks of soldiery for about 30 seconds before casually breaking through the besieging army and reaching the gate, not a man able to stop him. Presumably having received message of his coming via pigeon, the Duke of Louvain was incredibly happy to see Guy. Fun fact, when I first recorded this bit, I called him the Duke of Lorraine, because it just gets quite confusing. Lorraine are attacking, Louvain are defending, right? Anyway, and he let him in immediately, and Harold too, I suppose, because he was on the horse and it would have been awkward not to. I know there's a lot of dukes in this story now, duking it out between each other to be the dukiest duke, and I'm not sure it really matters how much you know your dukes apart. There are good dukes and bad dukes and neutral dukes, and which is largely determined by the direction of the wind and Guy's whims. The good Duke of Louvain, in this case, wasn't really a fighter anyway, and when Guy turned up, he just gave over command of all his troops straight away to the lad, who must be like 18, 19 now. But those troops, they had seen what Guy could do in the fairly bloody way he reached the gate, and so, when he told them that they had to follow his plan, and his plan you'll see a few times in this episode, open the gates and attack the enemy, not the typical plan for the defenders of a siege, the men sort of set their worries aside and gave a wholehearted cheer, swords in the air, Guy, Guy, Guy. And Guy soaked in the adulation. They formed up, Guy at their head, Harold just behind him. The city gates opened and the soldiers of Louvain charged out. Now what comes next is probably better as a film than described by a storyteller. Then there can be epic music, impressively choreographed fights, varying shots of the battlefield from sweeping aerial views to prolonged single-shot sequences with thousands of extras, to quick cuts of action, blades clashing, mud trampled underfoot, arrows loosing, blood splatter, close-up faces screaming triumph and terror. And I think in words this will only hold your attention for so long, especially as the outcome is unlikely to be a surprise. For under Guy's leadership, the troops of Louvain sallied forth and met the besieging forces of Lorraine, and because he couldn't quite be everywhere all the time, some of the Lorraine soldiers even got a couple of kills in themselves. But Guy carried the day. Where he rode, men died, bodies broken, blood flowed across the battlefield until it was crimson. And as with many a medieval battle, victory came not through a complete wipeout, but when the astonished, terrified besiegers, who'd come to take a city not to be attacked by some unkillable demon Englishman, lost their resolve and fled. And as they threw down their weapons, tore off their armour and leapt on their horses, there came a great cheer from the victors. The siege was lifted. Guy did not join in the cheer, for he was hot on the tail of the retreating men, Harold obedient as ever, following just behind. And after a moment's hesitation his brand new army followed him, and together they sliced through the retreating men like scythes through a field of wheat. Until finally, when the plain was full of dead and dying, Guy raised his sword and issued a command. In compassion for these Christian lives, I bid the slaughter cease. They turned, headed back to the city they had saved, Guy's horse accidentally crushing limbs and skulls under its hooves. Heroes. Now the Duke of Lorraine, when he heard about this loss, he was furious. Luckily for him and unluckily for them, he had plenty more soldiers where they came from, and he was quite sure that more soldiers was what was needed, which is a pretty reasonable response, understandable. He was going to put an end to this now. 30,000 horse and foot he assembled, and they marched on Louvain, the Duke proudly leading them from the rear. And if I didn't have enough words to do the last battle justice, I have not suddenly grown new ones now, so what happens next is, well, pretty damn similar to what just occurred, but on an even grander scale. Lorraine's army came to the city. Guy led Louvain's troops out, and a few hours later thousands of lives had been ended, and the crows and rats feasted like never before. For Guy, the whole thing had been an ecstasy of relentless slaughter. So many soldiers fell by his blades that they dulled, and he had to take up his enemy's weapons time and time again. His horse, tired, fell, had to be replaced over and over, but he did not stop, and the love of brutality, the frenzy, did not leave him for a good long while. Covered in blood, he revelled in that ecstatic fervour, and men soon ran from him rather than confronted him, and he loved the chase. Guy of Warwick, Lord of Murder. But eventually, when even he tired and the enemy had all fled, the rage left him, and that all-consuming hunger for slaughter was, for just a little while, sated. In gore-washed armour, he and Harold tracked down the Duke of Lorraine, the man whose ambition had caused all of this, left now but with a few of his most loyal men to defend him. He had seen now what Guy could do, and was in no doubt that this was anything but a monster. He awaited his fate, steeled his heart for what was to come, drew his sword, shaking all the while. Guy and Harold approached him. But Guy, briefly satiated, his victory sure, seemed to become in that moment someone else entirely, aware of things beyond the immediate battle, of his quest for renown and his reputation. Slaughtering common soldiers in their masses was one thing, but a duke, a Christian duke. So Guy made a proposal to the Duke of Lorraine. A peace between the two dukedoms that would last forever. Biggest, bestest, peaciest peace that ever peaced, so that the two enemy kingdoms, which were both Christian after all, would put aside their arms and embrace each other in friendship. Forget this huge misunderstanding. If the good Duke would permit it, of course. And here it seems the Guy truly believed, staring down the Duke on a battlefield full of his own dead soldiers, that he was dealing with someone as an equal in good faith. A peacemaker. Give him the Nobel Prize. The Duke of Lorraine, utterly reduced, army gone, ready to face his death, he agreed to this peace proposal at once, tried in fact not to weep from relief. "Great," said Guy, "fantastic, I'll get a bath, and then the Duke of Lorraine can come over and, well, you've got lots of provisions you won't be needing anymore, so why don't we have a feast with them all?" Yes, of course. "Wonderful," said Guy, and he thought a bit more. Used his knowledge of politics, how peace treaties worked. There may be an idea that had been put into his mind by the Duke of Louvain, and he said, "Oh, and you will of course be giving your eldest daughter's hand in marriage to the Duke of Louvain, the young, beautiful daughter, Matilda, yes? To seal the peace?" The Duke looked over the field of corpses already writhing with scavengers, beset by the black wings of the birds. "Daughter's hand in marriage to my worst enemy, of course. For peace," said Guy. "For peace," said the Duke. "Well, isn't that just marvellous? I'm so glad that we're all friends." And there was a big feast between the Dukes of Louvain and Lorraine and Guy, and everyone had a great time, and it was not at all weird that so many people had just died, a great number of them at Guy's hands. Oh, and there was a marriage as well, which was surely full of joy for Matilda and her father. And Guy was happy. This was the sort of thing that would make his reputation. The peacemaker he would become known as. It was sometime during these joyous celebrations that somebody, and I suspect one of the dukes here, may have slipped a little suggestion to Guy that surely, truly, if he wanted to hold himself up as the exemplar of noble virtues, then surely he must want to prove his Christian credentials. And there was a way that could be done, using his very particular set of skills. For wasn't at this very time Christianity itself under threat from the barbarous hordes of Mohammedans, Turks, Saracens, who were at that very time laying siege to Byzantium? And yes, the Byzantines were a bit odd with the whole bread rising thing, the Eastern Roman Empire as they were called. There's a dated joke for you, just a little levity, or unlevity as we call it in the West, of course. Where was I? Despite these oddities, they were Christians, and saving all of Christendom was the sort of thing that just might get you in the good graces of a certain Earl of Warwick, so he'll let you marry his daughter, which is, lest we forget, definitely the reason the guy is doing all of this. Even better, that way, he wouldn't have to kill any more Christians, not even poor ones. These people weren't even really human, were they? Wouldn't have to worry about any pangs of conscience about all the murders you've done. Not that those really seem to bother Guy anyway. Wouldn't that be better overall? Go to Greece, Anatolia, the Levant, far, far away from here, and then legends of your valour and your Christian virtue would surely flood back home. Whichever duke hadn't suggested this then chimed in perfect agreement, the two having realised that whatever their personal beef, well, things had been a lot better, a lot more predictable before Guy turned up and inserted himself into the middle of their feud. That episode of every TV programme from the 60s through 90s where there's a new threat and the usual heroes have to work together with the usual villains to defeat this evil in time for the end of the episode, so the status quo remains, nothing meaningful changes, and networks don't have to worry about broadcast order. But in that moment, the viewers see how the two sides actually kind of need one another, need this situation that they have, in some ways are drawn to each other. It's never acknowledged again, but for the viewers who saw that episode, it forever alters the meaning of the show. So it was with the Dukes of Lorraine and Louvain when they met Guy. So both of them were egging him on now, suggesting he go fight the forces assailing Christianity. And Guy was completely won over by the strength of their arguments, and he said, "You are right. We need to preserve the church, be warriors for Christ. It is our sacred duty. I will do it." Relieved Duke noises. "All I will need is, let's say, 1,000 soldiers from each of you, along with a few months of supplies for them, and I will lead them in the greatest fight back against Islam until the Reconquista." The Duke of Lorraine noticeably tightened his grip on the arm of his chair, ground his teeth, smiled, didn't say, "You killed so many men, so many, I'm so beaten, please don't take any more, leave me with a few," crying Duke noises. Instead, through gritted teeth, he said, "Of course, be delighted to help you out." And the Duke of Louvain, who's definitely coming out better of this, but still wasn't the keenest to part with all those men, agreed as well. "Oh, so happy to help, of course." "Great!" Guy beamed, a happy smile, and I am once again left unsure if he knows that everything he's asking for is interpreted as being underpinned with heavy threats by those around him. Possibly he is actually actively making those threats, he's in on it, but I think it's pretty likely he just thinks everyone's really nice to him, great guys, a lot of them, and his mass murder skills aren't a factor in how he is treated. "Oh, and I'll need some ships too, to sail to the Mediterranean with my new army, you know." "Of course. For God and Christendom. God and Christendom." And so, with presumably a fair bit of ado to make all those arrangements, off sets Guy, sailing from the north coast of Europe all the way down to the Mediterranean. Now, not just a single superhuman warrior, but a superhuman warrior in lead of a reasonably sized military force. This is rapidly turning into a full-blown historical epic. A month has passed. Guy's fleet rounds the coast of Italy, and his own ship is well ahead of the rest, out of sight, because that's the kind of guy he was. Though he now had all these troops, I don't think command and tactics and stuff like this was really his strength. Why would it need to be, after all? 3 Turkish ships spot his. Of course, Guy takes no evasive course of action. This is what he wants, to the nervousness of the men on board. He's going to wait for the ships to come alongside, they're going to attempt to board him, and it all kicks off. Guy smiles disdainfully. The blood begins to rise. He can feel it pumping through him. It's been a month without him killing anyone. This is it. This is the good stuff. He screams a war cry and he pulls out his famous flaming sword. You know, the famous flaming sword which has definitely made an appearance in this story before. It's magic or some shit. Maybe Merlin gave it to him. Like, Merlin's involved with 90% of magical weapons in British romances, right? Yeah, something like that. I'm sure I covered it before. Must have. Wouldn't just drop something like that in, right? Absolute health and safety. Nightmare to carry that on a ship, though. Getting away from the point. Guy draws his sword, flames shoot along it, and as the ships draw level, before a single Turk can leap to his ship, Guy leaps to theirs. And he cuts and he stabs and he hacks and fire leaps from his blade and catches pitch. There's screaming and blood and the clash of blades and the whoosh of wood going up. Guy's laughter, guts spilled, heads flying, masts breaking, sails falling. Guy's crew did their bit too. They had a catapult on board for some reason and were just flinging burning tar at one of the other ships. I think they were doing this mostly because it looked really cool. Very quickly, the two ships that weren't being boarded by Guy, they got the picture. They attempted to disengage, which of course enraged Guy. That first ship was now a raging inferno, its few remaining living crew members jumping into the water out of desperation, leaving the wounded and dead alike to be devoured by the flames. Guy's done here. He runs to the edge of the ship, takes a great flying leap onto the nearest other ship, and tears that apart in a similar, just as deadly manner. While he's doing that, the rest of his crew pursue the third ship. Maybe because they don't want to look at all the murder Guy is doing. And they accept the desperate surrender of the Turkish vessel. Its crew are throwing down their weapons and grovelling all over the place. Don't give us to him. There are no survivors on the second ship, as Guy dramatically leaps from the flaming wreckage before it sinks under the waves, absolutely caked in blood, and he lands on the deck of the third Turkish ship, sword still aflame. And he's about to start hacking things up when he notices that the guy he's about to put his sword through has a familiar look and is holding up his hands. "Guy, it's us," says Harold. "Remember? Friends?" "Friends. Friends," says Guy, and his berserk fury shuts off. He shakes his head a bit. His eyes turn back to normal. Maybe the flame sword depowers or whatever. And it's now just a regular, completely safe sword. "We've got prisoners," says Harold. "Prisoners. They're useful for things." "Good, good," says Guy. And much to everyone's relief, he doesn't slaughter all the prisoners. Which also leaves the loot, which, as any player of RPGs or soldier in a medieval mercenary army knows, is the best bit. And the loot is decidedly unavailable in the two ships now making their way 1,000 fathoms deep. And at this stage, the rest of Guy's ships, there are quite a lot of them, turn up. See the destruction and there's a, "What happened here then?" "Oh, nothing much," and everyone laughs and there's a freeze frame. But this is all just interlude, for ahead of them lies the Dardanelles, and beyond that the Sea of Marmara and the Bosporus, and there Byzantium, or Constantinople. I covered the whole name thing on the Shoemaker of Constantinople episode. Check whatever I said there for details. Whatever its name, this was the largest, richest, just all-round greatest city in Europe, the seat of the Patriarch of Constantinople, and currently under siege by the army of the Sultan of Babylon, which was exactly what Guy was hoping for. That army was, of course, vast, uncountable, the greatest force that had ever been assembled, a civilization-ending horde and other suspect Orientalist tropes. Now the city was being defended not by the Byzantines, but by warriors from all over Europe, and particularly by the Saxons, the original Saxons, not the Anglo ones, led by a Saxon man named Albertus. And while they were doing a fine job, they were considerably outnumbered. So gradually, day after day, the siege remained, the defenders grew ever weaker. It seemed only a matter of time before the great city would fall, and with it, all of Europe would be open for the taking. So we have an unbeatable opponent. Hopes are low. But Guy of Warwick arrives on the scene as though he's a plucky underdog, and things are set to change. When they arrive in the city, the people there, Albertus, accept Guy, of course, as their natural leader. And he says, in defiance of all usual strategic and tactical considerations, the defenders will sally forth onto the Great Plain and do battle with the masses there, despite the massive disparity in numbers. This is Guy's usual plan, but with a twist, because, in a first, this is a surprise nighttime attack. Guy's sword is apparently not flaming, for it reflects the moon dramatically, and he heads out onto the field with the men directly under his command. The 2,000 of them slay 40,000 of the enemy. Stealth builds pay off, people. Well, it started stealthily, but very quickly it wasn't, becoming a massacre, and the Guy of Warwick special, a rout. To quote my source on this, legs, heads, broken arms, and mangled shirts of mail blanketed a scarlet plain, and Guy himself killed so many that the bodies stacked up like ramparts around him. And yes, I have questions about this last part. Were people climbing up onto bodies to try to get at Guy? Or was he just killing people and then throwing them backwards onto great big murder piles that were building up behind him? Neither one strikes me as exactly right, but the details don't matter exactly. The main thing is, there are piles of dead bodies. And this is just night one. The Sultan of Baghdad, who is going to be a very much in the background sort of villain, if villain is really the right term, which it's not. He, just like the Count of Lorraine before him, though on a far grander scale, treats this defeat as simply an annoyance. Thinks that all he has to do is throw more men at it, and Guy will inevitably be crushed, Christianity along with him. So the next day dawns, and the beat of 1,000 drums, the sounding of 1,000 trumpets, signals the full-scale assault on the city to begin. The footsteps of hundreds of thousands of men marching in lockstep shook the very earth itself, accompanied by the thunderous din of hoofbeats, and the rumble of siege engines being brought forward and assembled, great wooden wheels on monstrous machines that would reduce the greatest walls in the world to rubble. They would finish this today. Guy watched from the walls with Albertus and Harold. I don't know where the actual Byzantines were, making themselves scarce, probably quite sensibly. This was it, the battle for Constantinople and Christianity itself. It was down to them, because Jesus didn't seem like he was going to show up for some reason. Guy had a plan. Can you guess what the plan was? That's right. Use the advantage of the walls to help wear them. No. It is take the 12,000 men they had between them. This is a very numbers, stats-focused story here. And ride out onto the plain and engage the enemy just straight up. And we must remember that men don't necessarily act like units in a strategy game, unfalteringly obeying every command from some omnipotent player, even when certain death beckons. This was all the more true of older armies, where loyalty was a lot more due to pay and aforementioned spoils than for some higher cause, and training and discipline were variable to say the least. But these men had seen what Guy was capable of, some of them a number of times, and the rest had at least had a chance to take in the ridiculously gruesome towering piles of enemy bodies now outside their walls, which Guy had built overnight. And they knew that this was no ordinary man. And now, gentle listener, I find myself having to repeat what I said earlier, but even more vociferously. The problem with what is about to happen here, of which you have a pretty good idea, is that it might make for a great anime sequence or a superhero film, but to describe it yet again to you might be a little dull and repetitive, especially because there are no stakes here. What do you mean, Graham? Surely Guy could be defeated? No, No, he couldn't be. Guy is not going to die here, that's sort of the point. You know that all the stakes the story might want to give by emphasising how powerful the army was, how many men, and how fierce they were, is all fake. Guy will win the same way he has done every time before. Yes, this is the big set-piece battle which ends Volume 2 of Guy of Warwick. And it is an epic, adrenaline-pumping, action-packed screen spectacular, whether animated, live-action or CGI. Think of all the fights before, but just scaled up to mind-bending proportions for a premium IMAX experience. But it's going to sound quite a lot like all the other battles I've described to you today. I'll do my best. Guy leads the 12,000 out into the field. The combined Turkish-Arabic forces are surprised, but not in an unwelcome way, as the defenders are voluntarily discarding their greatest advantage. The men shrug, stop assembling siege engines, mount their horses, draw their swords, prepare to crush this insignificant force. Guy orders his archers to form up, to loose arrows, and then, with little tactics, the rest of them charged. The thundering hooves of the enemy cavalry should have mowed them down. But any horses unfortunate to charge Guy were clean cleaved in twain. The legs collapsing, the top of the horse carried forward by momentum before landing with a wet mushy sound drowned out by the din of the battle. The astonished riders cast to the ground before being crushed mercilessly under Guy's foot. He hewed his bloody way through ranks of the enemy, the angel of death in his eyes. Those who did not fall fled, backwards, running into, tripping over their oncoming comrades in their desperation to get away, dying in the crush. No blade, no spear, no arrow touched Guy. Men died. The giant of the Saracens, Elamedant, 10 feet tall, wielding a sword as heavy as a normal person, found Guy at the head of piles of bodies. And for a few moments, he held Guy in an actual fight, blades clashing, parrying. A tiny sliver of hope for the remaining Arabic troops before, of course, Guy's sword cut across Elamedant's armour. Once, twice, thrice, leaving marks as though of some gigantic clawed beast. And then, as the giant turned to flee, Guy finished him off with a final cleave through the helmet and deep into his skull. Now, some of the men on Guy's side of the battlefield did die. Quite a few, in fact. But not sufficient for it to change the weight of the tide which flowed from Guy. It was not just by actually killing them, of course, but all those who saw him fight were forced to confront the utter helplessness of their own situation. So they fled into the woods and the marshes that surrounded, paying no heed to appeals and threats of the senior ranks who hadn't seen him. You don't understand. They recognised this was hopeless, that Guy was something else. And they weren't having it. And once again he's in his element, hacking and slashing, cleaving and smashing, stabbing and slicing, and all the while consumed by an instinct to kill, 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 and kill he did, shouting and screaming and killing, killing, killing. The slaughter and the bloodshed was endless ecstasy to him. Guy of Warwick was deaf, deaf was him, the two the very same, and he loved it all. It was only sustained whooping and hollering that sort of nudged a bit of his brain that was telling him it had been going on for several minutes when his senses finally returned. He blinked, looked down to see a body in front of him. Crushed and warped, so the features were unrecognisable, but by its armour, its clothing, its crown, he could tell the Sultan of Baghdad, dead before him. He had won. The people around him cheered. It was done. The battle won. Constantinople was saved. The enemies of Christ defeated. Christianity saved. And no one in Europe, probably the world, mightier than Guy of Warwick. The celebrations in the city lasted a week. A statue of Guy was commissioned. Everyone fawned over him. Women threw themselves at him. Men threw themselves at him. Everyone praised him wherever he went, thanked him, got down on their knees and showered him with worship. And Guy ate the praise up, but he found the meal which had once been so sustaining was now just expected. the intense adoration of commoners and nobles alike was just the backdrop to his life. It was how it was now. And so it excited him little. He considered what he had done. Killed Duke Otton's men, killed the Duke of Lorraine's men, and now killed the Sultan of Baghdad and his army. And all of this episode was just a blur, a haze of blood and guts and broken bones, the feel of the sword in the hand and the screams of the dying. Surely now he had done enough. He could go back to England, to finally marry Felice. That would surely bring him happiness. Yes, back to England he would go. But before Guy leaves Constantinople, probably as some of the sorting everything out which always has to be done is being done, him and Harold take a little trip, some well-deserved time off, where they can just relax and not fight anything. Enjoy a stroll in a nearby forest. A well-deserved break. Harold is presumably either not suffering any post-traumatic distress associated with the last time he took a walk in a forest, or, well, he is, but he's going anyway because that's where Guy's going. They were having a nice, peaceful time. Guy was getting a little bored, when suddenly there came the loudest, most awful noise you could imagine, unlike anything that they'd ever heard before. Harold turned in alarm, Guy turned in delight. What was that? The sound came again, and then became a constant roar, and as their ears struggled to make sense of it, eventually it seemed as though it was some sort of animal noise, roaring. Not just of one animal, of many maybe. But animals that neither of them had heard before, and far louder than any regular beasts. Give that a wide berth, said Harold. Oh, Harold, you kid, let's go check it out, said Guy. Oh, yes, that's what I meant. Following the bellows, they eventually emerged into a clearing in the middle of which was an extraordinary sight. A huge lion, massive mane, and a dragon, and I quote, encountering each other furiously. Which sounds very much like a book-talk euphemism, but obviously just means that they were fighting. And look, compared to humans, lions are terrifying, but compared to your average dragon, hardly seems like a fair fight. And indeed, the lion seemed to be losing, though holding its own for longer than you might expect. Guy, of course, loved this bit of blood sport, leant back against a tree to watch. This is amazing. You know what, Harold? Whichever one of these wins, I'll test my blade against it. Great, said Harold. And I don't need to describe a big battle here. The battle did not last long at all. The lion was soon overcome by the dragon's poisonous breath, which was a standard feature of dragons back in the day that we tend to overlook these days. Right, said Guy, that's me up. And he raised his sword, ran full pelt at the beast, swung down with all his might. The blade made contact with the hide and bounced right off. The dragon's huge scaly head whipped around to stare at Guy. And for the first time in a very long time, Guy of Warwick felt a slight shiver of fear. Okay, discussion section. Last time I covered a bit of a general overview of the text. Here's a very quick summary of that. Guy of Warwick was a medieval romance written about 1240-ish in Anglo-Norman that became insanely popular for centuries afterwards, basically right up until the 20th century when it massively fell out of favour. Unsurprisingly, it was particularly popular here in England, one of the nation's favourite stories really, but internationally as well, and it spawned many different retellings over the ages, written and oral, which while they do change focus, and there's quite a lot of research on that, remain at their core quite similar, I think, though I will discuss some of the other big variants on a later discussion section. I am giving a fairly faithfully, for my standards, retelling of a 1681 version of this tale written in prose. So in this discussion section I'm going to talk a little bit more about Guy, Warwick Castle and the Earls of Warwick, and a little bit too about the violence inherent in the story. So, in a personal note, unusual for these discussion sections, I feel it's relevant to say that at the time of recording last episode, I'd never been to Warwick, even though it's pretty close to me, certainly by American terms. But inspired by my reading of Guy's legend, I took a day trip there after recording the last episode, most of which was spent at the castle, but I also got a little time to look around the town. For what it's worth, my 2 cents on the castle. Unusually for British castles, it's owned by an entertainment company, Merlin Entertainments. Other entertainment companies are available, and they've really leaned into the selling point of the attraction being lots of live action events. That is their major thing. Jousts and archery and people dressed up, and most impressively of all probably, or at least most unusually of all, the firing of a huge working trebuchet they have there, which is a pretty rare sight. And I, of course, managed to go well out of season on a very off day, and so none of that was going on. There's also a live-action torture dungeon, which you pay extra for, and a mannequin-filled dungeon. I didn't go to either because I'm terrified of horror, and because the person I was with is terrified of mannequins. Which makes it sound like I didn't do very much, but I did get a good explore of the castle in. And despite much stuff not being on, I did see the falconry show, which was very impressive. Kudos to the actors and bird handlers there, so if the other entertainment is anything like that quality, then I reckon it's a very good thing indeed, and I hope to go back and get the full experience sometime soon. This setup does of course mean that it's pricier than most castles I've been to, and yes, I have been to rather a lot, if I do say so myself. And the history part of the castle, my favourite really, is definitely relatively neglected, though they've done enough, especially with some video bits, which were pretty cool, but not enough detailed plaques to read. You know, the kind of stuff that most people absolutely hate. Yep, I've got a problem. So with those caveats in mind, I definitely recommend it as a good day out. Just don't go out of season. The feedback I did leave there, slightly tongue-in-cheek, was that it needed more Guy of Warwick related stuff. But in some ways I was being serious, particularly given the surprisingly large role of the mythical Guy in Warwick Castle, via the Earls of Warwick who owned the castle. Now the castle dates back to just after the Norman Conquest, 1068, though there were earlier forts at Warwick, and 1068 is a rough couple of centuries before Guy of Warwick was composed, but also a few centuries, give or take, after Guy of Warwick the story is set. Now that the castle didn't exist when it was supposedly set didn't bother the authors of the story, what with a few bits being set there. Despite protestations to the contrary, there's really no doubt that as much as the story corresponds to any real historical period, it's much closer to being contemporaneous with when it was written than the actual Anglo-Saxon era it was purported to be, what with the Crusades and castles and knights and ladies, etc. But as I skipped over in the last episode, Guy of Warwick's association with the real castle was firmly established by the Beauchamp family, spelt Beauchamp, who became the Earls of Warwick from 1268. So, while they weren't the Earls when the story was written, they really took the legend to heart. Now, you'll sometimes see written in articles about Guy online that it is, quote, an ancestral romance, possibly written expressly to help give legitimacy and heroic ancestry to either Henry or Thomas de Beaumont, Earls of Warwick from the 1220 to the 1240s, before the Beauchamps. But while that's often purported, such a theory seems to be pretty controversial and challenged elsewhere. However, while family and ancestry may or may not have given origin to the legend, the later Beauchamps, with their enthusiasm for Guy of Warwick, definitely treated it as such. They embraced the legend so wholeheartedly, in fact, that the second Earl, born 1272, only 4 years after the family took over the earldom, well, he was named Guy after Guy of Warwick. So then there was a real Guy of Warwick. And if you think it's a fluke, Thomas Beauchamp also named another son after a different character from the Guy of Warwick story, a character who hasn't appeared yet, so I'm not going to name. But yes, he was just naming his sons after characters from a book. And soon thereafter, all sorts of things said to have once belonged to Guy of Warwick turn up in the possession of the Beauchamp family. In 1369, a coat of mail said to have once belonged to Guy of Warwick was passed on in a will, and by 1400, Guy of Warwick's coat of mail had been joined by Guy of Warwick's sword. There are also mentions of versions of the story that they have and items decorated with scenes from the story. Now, all these items really existed. They were real things, clearly important to the Beechams in establishing their descent from the, let's remember, non-existent Guy. In the 1380s, Guy's Tower was even added to Warwick Castle, which could of course refer to both the fictitious and the real-life Guy. The Earls also had a very large statue of Guy of Warwick placed at Guy's Cliff. Guy's Cliff is a place in Warwick far away from the castle, but which has a long association with the legend and has become a focal spot for pilgrimage tourism about it. As it's not made its appearance in the story yet, I'm not going to go into it now, but the takeaway from all of this is that the Beechams were clearly doing quite a lot to tie themselves and their family history to Guy of Warwick. And lest you think of this as some family of rich eccentrics spending their time making props for some old story because they were fans, it wasn't like that at all. The Beauchamp Earls of Warwick were very powerful political and military players, key players, whose names crop up with all kinds of events that those of a certain age might know from 1066 and all that. For instance, Guy of Warwick, the real one, was heavily involved in the execution of Piers Gaveston, who was held and tried in Warwick Castle. Thomas de Beauchamp, on the other hand, was a key commander at Poitiers and Crécy. Henry Beauchamp was the closest childhood friend of Henry VI. You get the idea. And the whole artefact and descendancy from Guy of Warwick was high-level propaganda, helping legitimise their claim to the earldom from a serious, highly elite family. And this only works because Guy of Warwick was often said to be, by real historians, a real historical figure, dragons aside. And while there may have been real family pride in the connection with him, especially generations removed from the conscious myth-making, this tying themselves to the historical Guy and his legend was some serious politicking. As a thesis by Sebastian Barfield puts it, quote, "The family honour and ancestry was an invented one," unquote, but the, quote, "adoption of the Guy of Warwick legend must, at least in part, have been motivated by shrewd political and practical purposes," unquote. And I think it's the continued patronage of this story by the family that makes it still resonate so much locally in Warwick today, as well as nationally, which is rare for a romance. This connection to Guy is less obvious today than it once was, but it's still there. You can see it here and there all over the town in little architectural touches, and the tourist information map has Guy of Warwick plastered all over it. I mean, the children's one has. That's the one I got. And this association and the artefacts of Guy at the castle persisted even after the Beauchamp family were no longer earls. In the 1500s, the Dudley family Earl of Warwicks were also extremely attached to the Guy of Warwick legend, apparently paying the salary of a keeper of Guy's sword, which I assume wasn't a full-time job, but I'm not quite sure. And in the late 1500s, Guy of Warwick's existence was a key part of a very serious legal dispute, contesting the claim of the Dudley Earls. A dispute which involved that family tree descending from Guy of Warwick. I should say that the family tree that was being disputed, both in terms of Guy's ancestors and descendants, is quite different from the one in the actual story. But the important part is that Guy was then supposed to have lived in the early 900s. This legal case, which was fought in the highest courts in the land, only came to an end when the rival claimant, Edward Arden, was executed on unrelated charges, basically being a Catholic, but his attempt to use his family's purported ancestry from Guy of Warwick was probably a big part of the real reason for his arrest. A legend written about the 1200s had, by the late 1500s, become taken as real history to the extent that it had a very real effect on national politics. Power of stories, eh? And even after the Dudleys, when the castle became more of a manor house, the artefacts of Guy of Warwick remained there, displayed to visitors for centuries more. These artefacts had grown to include not just the sword, but a rib of the dun cow. We will actually come back to that in the later episode, I promise. That was actually either a whalebone or whale tusk. Guy's porridge pot, that's just a huge cauldron. And Guy's fork, a giant fork. These latter reflecting the way that heroes almost invariably become giants in some local legends or understanding. Robin Hood, Fionn McCool, King Arthur, and Guy of Warwick. Over the centuries, the exact relics have changed multiple times, but remained on display and seen by a great many, for there are numerous references to them in travellogues and the like. Essentially, by the end of the 17th century, they are serving as proto-tourist attractions in the castle, even if the tourists were only the very wealthiest. Even though nobody really believed they were what they were purported to be, people seemed to like them, or find them very silly, or both. There are still some of those artefacts there today: the sword, the porridge pot, the rib of the dun cow, and a couple of others, which I was very excited about seeing, and we took some very terrible photos of. And not all of that was on me, because I have to say they were given what I consider very poor prominence at the castle, given everything else it's got going on. It's sort of tucked away and badly with only minimal information about them. Which, yeah, I get that a legend that was once one of the most popular in England, and now basically nobody knows or cares about, is not exactly going to be your biggest draw when you've got actual knights and a firing trebuchet, but I reckon they could do more with them. Now, Warwick itself does do more with Guy of Warwick. There is a Guy of Warwick society. They put on events at Guy's Cliff sometimes. But unfortunately those do seem quite rare, though I'll have to get along to one at some point. Can you tell that I want the world to give Guy of Warwick more love? Because I do. Anyway, to sum up this section, Guy of Warwick: propaganda, fake claims to lineage, and tourist attraction. To just modify that last part a bit though, while I want the world to give Guy of Warwick more love, I'm not sure I can justify that, because I think it's just because I've gone really hard down this rabbit hole, really engaged with this story now and its different versions. But when it comes to the actual story, look, I understand why it fell out of fashion and the Arthurian literature, for instance, didn't. You know, we've got action films now, and before then we had pulp novels, right? I've mentioned that comparison a lot in this episode because I think there's some real truth to it. Much of the story does seem to be along those veins. Very violent, very revelling in description of battles and duels, and Guy being amazing at winning them. Just fighting endless different antagonists like many an anime as well. In my view, that's a lot of the story. Lots of academic analysis around Guy of Warwick really focuses on the gender aspects of the story, how that changes across different versions, about the morals of the tale, particularly in how the tale ends, which I obviously won't spoil now. Or if not that, then the ancestry claims about it, what it says about legal systems and systems of rule, what it says about expectations of men of a certain class. And to a lesser degree, when people talk about the story, they also discuss Guy in his role as a killer of monsters, of which more to come next episode. But the majority of the actual words of the story is pretty much the sort of thing I've told you here, an endless succession of fights of varying levels, and in between, going to feasts. And this is true of the 17th century version I'm telling, but it's also right there in the Middle English versions, even the incredibly long rhyming ones. Guy is perhaps in those versions slightly less invincible. He does get hurt sometimes, but overall the balance of the story between Guy doing anything at all with Felice, or anything supernatural, versus Guy being in fights with actual human men, or tournaments with actual humans, and just killing them all over the place, well, it's heavily skewed towards the latter. Seriously, in a version from the 1400s, it seems every second line is just Guy slew many men, and he killed that man and this man, and cut off an arm and smashes in a head, for hundreds and hundreds of lines. In fact, there's hundreds of pages of this. I've linked that to text on the website if you want. So in versions at least of the written stories, we don't have access to the oral ones, this is the largest part of the story. Maybe what makes it enduring is its themes and all that stuff with Felice, but what we're actually reading is not the romance, it's the fighting. This isn't entirely dissimilar to other medieval romances, but I think it's very marked in this one. And in this episode I hope I've given you a real taste of this, so you don't get a false impression of Guy of Warwick that I think some readers of the text tend to give by glossing over how much of it is just this stuff. Not for nefarious reasons, by the way. A summary has to give the key points, and all the different dukes he fights again and again are easily condensed down. Guy fought a lot of people. The point I'm now overlabouring is that this story is a blood-filled gore fest, and all about numbers and battles and killing. In fact, I think in my telling it actually may be proportionally less than in many, because I just can't deal with all the repetition. It's there in all the longer tellings of this, at least up to the 19th century, and clearly for this story to remain so popular, this aspect must have been a great deal of its appeal. People like repetitive descriptions of violence and how their favourite hero just is better than everybody else over and over again. Which really, given much of media today, shows that things haven't changed that much. And that's not a criticism, by the way. Now, I do hope you haven't quite got bored of my descriptions of the battles yet. There are some to come in the next episodes, though the opponents do start to vary a little. So yes, episodes. I've decided I'm going to have to do this as a 4-parter. It's just too long. When I planned this out, I thought I would essentially condense what I've told you today into about 15 minutes. I didn't. And that's because I wanted to give the story its room to breathe, and because brevity's not really my forte. And I know I've also failed to get this out as fast as I would have liked, though it's definitely quicker than the episode before it, but that is for reasons which will possibly become apparent later this year, I hope, maybe. More information on the Patreon if you're interested in that. However, because I've now got 2 episodes to go, rather than making Guy of Warwick last for months and months, I'm going to break this up with a standalone episode next. I have a couple of ideas on what that will be, but I've not decided yet. But it'll certainly be something faster, shorter, one-off. And then I'm going to give this story its due when I come back to it. Okay, I think that's the discussion section over for now. I can't wait to tell you the rest of the story. Thank you for bearing with me. And now comes my customary massive thank you to everyone who is listening to this now. My podcast output is terrible for keeping me up there in the charts and in the algorithms and the like, and I really appreciate therefore every one of you who is still enjoying this. Thank you, and I'm so glad that you are. I'm not planning on doing another Patreon episode soon, simply because I don't feel I've done enough on the main feed to justify it. One did come out a couple of months ago. A reminder, my patrons only pay when I actually make an episode. But if you do want to sign up there now, you get 15 episodes you can listen to immediately. Massive thanks to everyone who has done that already. It means a lot. Thanks this time particularly to Isaac Norwood and Helen Ryder, who signed up since the last episode. And thanks all again for listening. So until next time, this is Tales of Britain and Ireland signing off. And I know you're disappointed. So I promise you, the cow is still coming. You can follow Tales of Britain and Ireland podcast on Blue Sky, Instagram, Threads and Facebook. There's also a website, talesofbritainandireland.com, where there's a page for each episode which contains more information, including illustrations, asides and recaps, along with other additional bits and pieces to explore. The intro music was written and performed by Alice Nichols, and the outro music by Mitch Keeley and Josh Newman. And you can find all the other musical credits on the episode page on the website. If you enjoyed this podcast, then please do share it with others or give it a review, as those really are the best ways to help us out. You can also join Tales of Britain and Ireland on Patreon to get extra members episodes. Thank you so much for listening, and I hope you'll join me again soon.